You know we're going to do a lot of different things in this section when I have 4 different things up on the title board. And we are going to hit static routes, a couple of different kinds of static routes. And we're going to work with loopbacks, and we're going to do some pings, and I'm going to introduce you to a hub and spoke network. And we're going to see in this section, and especially the next one, how a hub and spoke network not only works, but how that network design, which is pretty darn common, can really be impacted by your choice of routing protocol. But in this case, we're not using a routing protocol yet. We're working with static routes. And speaking of those, we really have 4 different kinds of static routes. We have what I would just call a regular static route, where you're saying, okay, to go to this destination network, I want to use this next hop IP address or exit interface. Then you have what we call a host route or a host static route. And a host route is a route to one host and one host only. And I'm going to work that into this lab that we've got coming up here in a minute, and you'll see exactly how to write a host static route. Floating static routes, we're going to wait a couple of sections on those, because the first thing that I asked when I saw the name of this was floating on what? So you'll see exactly what they're floating on after we cover a dynamic routing protocol coming up in the next section. And then we have default static routes, which I believe we've seen one in action, but we're definitely going to see another one here. So you will definitely have those down in time for the exam as well. This is the network we're going to use, and I suggest you write this down because I'm not going to continually come back to it. We're going to be on a couple of screens here, and then mostly we're going to be in the telnet window to the live rack. So the router 1 is our hub router, serial 10 interface, as you see, and the IP addresses that are on the serial interfaces of all 3 routers belong to the 172.12.123.0/24 network. And as always in my labs, I use the router number as the last octet. Keeps things a little more organized. We've got a couple of loopbacks here on routers 2 and 3, and router 2, I just called that loopback 2 and gave it an address of 2222. And that is subnetted with a /24 mask, 333/24 or 3333/24, left an octet out there. That's over on router 3. So this is where we are right now, and the first question you have here might be, what's going on with these loopbacks? Because I've mentioned them in passing, but we really haven't configured one yet or worked with them. And the loopback interfaces that you're going to see here on the routers are logical interfaces. If you go to the back or even the front of a Cisco router, you'll see, a console port, you'll see some serial ports, you'll see some fast Ethernet ports, maybe even gig Ethernet ports, but one thing you're not going to see is a port that says lodge 1 or loop 1 or something like that. They're not shown connecting to anything in this diagram. They're just zipping out there. And in the past, when we've been working with switches, they've been connected to hosts, they've been connected to routers. Routers are usually connected to something, but these loopback interfaces, they're kind of like interfaces to nowhere. Now, the next question is, why would I ever use a loopback interface if it's an interface to nowhere? What you will learn, I hate saying this because I really want to introduce you to a lot of these things now, you will learn more and more uses for loopbacks as you go through your studies. Most of the uses for loopbacks involve something pretty complex, and it's something we don't want to get into yet. But for our lab work, they serve a fantastic purpose to give us more networks to work with. We're not limited to the number of serial or physical interfaces that we have on the router. If I want 20 networks to work with in a lab, I can create 20 loopbacks. The router doesn't care. And again, they're treated by a routing protocol or by static routes as if they were a physical interface. So there's absolutely nothing to it. I'm going to show you real quick. This will need a little lining up. There we go. We're over here on router 1. I've already configured all of those interfaces, but I want to show you how to configure a loopback, and it's very simple. If I wanted to call one loopback 11, and you're not limited to that, because as you can see, you can 0 through a really big number, but I will go with 11, and you can attach it right to the word loopback too if you want to. And let's say I wanted to give it IP address. You'll get a little message there right on time. Line protocol on interface loopback 11 is up. Notice that we didn't get a message about the physical state of the interface because there is really no physical state. When I do a show interface here in a moment on the loopback, it will show something in the physical spot. But what we're concerned about really is just the line protocol coming up. But with a loopback, you really shouldn't have any problems with it. The line protocol should come up as soon as you name it. So if I put IP address 11.111.255.55.55.0 on here, that would be it. And I could do a show interface loopback 11, And you'll see that the top information looks a lot like the other ones that we've seen so far with this command. You'll see there's loopback 11 is up, so we know that's usually the physical state of the interface. And here it's just about always going to say up. Line protocol is up, so we're good there. Hardware is loopback, so there's a clue. And there's the IP address and all the other information that you'll get into later in your studies. It's all going to be there for a loopback interface. Now, while we're here, let me show you something else while we're here. Remember that IP address that's reserved for loopbacks? You remember what that was? It's 127.0.0.0. So if I try to give this address or an address from that range, you're going to get not a valid host address. This is a reminder that even though that is reserved for loopback interfaces, that entire range, it doesn't mean Cisco router loopback interfaces. So you still have to give the interfaces, your loopback interfaces on a Cisco router, a routable address. So the router is going to be kind enough to say, hey, Chris, it's not a valid host address. But of course, the exam will not be as kind, so that's a good thing to keep in mind. Now, let's also say that I wanted to take these loopbacks off, because it's just as important to know how to take them off as it is to put them on. So now I've got loopbacks 11 and 12 that aren't really involved in my lab, and I want to take them off now before I get started. And all I would need to do for that is put a no in front of this. Let's see if I can do it from there. Yeah, that's the message I wanted to show you. And you'll get another one. This is a very unusual message, and it's the only place you'll ever see this, and I'll show you the whole thing. Not all config may be removed and may reappear after reactivating the logical interface / sub-interfaces. Sounds to me like this router is haunted. Well, it's really not, but this can be a frustrating thing, because what'll happen is, pardon me, what'll happen on occasion is you take a loopback off, and then you want to put it back on. And it's like, okay, now I want to use interface loopback 11, and I want to give it IP address, 111.11.11/24. And when you go on there to put interface loopback 11 back on, it's going to call up its old IP address, the one it had a minute ago. Pardon me. Not every single time, but it does happen. So what I strongly suggest to you, from years of experience working in lab stuff and working with loopback interfaces, really the only way to truly get rid of them is to remove them like this, or do a write erase and reload the router. And when you reload the router, that clears the old information. It's just an odd thing. It's more of a real world thing that's not going to come up on your exam, but it's definitely something I wanted you to know about loopbacks in case you work with them in a lab or a production network. It's like, well, where'd this come from? So that long message about not all config may be removed and may reappear, pay attention to that and give your router a reload after you take loopbacks off and then try to put them right back on. Before I put them back on, I would reload the router. So I think that's really enough about loopbacks for right now. Let's go ahead and send a couple of pings around, and we'll go back to the board here for a moment. And what we're going to do first is ping routers 2 and 3 on their serial interfaces. So it's 123.2 and 123.3. And this is a good thing to do before a lab anyway, and I usually do it off camera, but I will always check my connections before I start any kind of lab, because then if something goes wrong in the lab and maybe I'm troubleshooting the wrong thing, if I had an IP address wrong or something, I'd rather know about it before I got started with my lab. So we will go ahead and ping 172.12.123.2, and we got a pretty fast return. That's always a good sign. And we got 5 exclamation points there as well. With pings, that's exactly what we want, because you can see what we're sending. We're sending 5 100-byte ICMP echo packets to, and here's the address we're sending them to. There's a timeout of 2 seconds, but we didn't have to worry about that because they all came back immediately. And you remember what that escape sequence is, right? Control-Shift-6, Control-Shift-6. We'll see in a later lab where that really comes in handy. So there are the pings. We sent them out. They came right back. But how did they do that? Remind me how they did that, because I haven't configured any routing protocols. I haven't written any static routes. I haven't done anything like that at all. And we're going to pick up with that at the beginning of the very next video and proceed with the lab from there.